The Arctic convoy routes were among the most dangerous lifelines of the Second World War, icy, remote, and constantly hunted. In February 1942, one such convoy, known as PQ-17, prepared to sail from WWII, Iceland, carrying vital war supplies for the Soviet front. To the men aboard the 35 merchant ships and their Royal Navy escorts, the journey promised both duty and danger. Few, however, could imagine that somewhere in the fog-shrouded North Atlantic, an entire escort group would simply vanish. The preparations in Iceland were hurried but methodical. The temperature hovered near freezing as sailors loaded ammunition, food, and tank parts bound for Murmansk. The convoy's escort, composed of destroyers, corvettes, and trawlers from both the Royal Navy and the US Navy, was tasked with protecting these lifelines through what Churchill called the worst journey in the world. Among them was Escort Force H, led by the aging light cruiser HMS Dunedin and accompanied by the destroyers HMS Volunteer and USS Elliott. Their mission: provide close-range protection against U-boats and respond to air or surface threats detected along the northern route. Sailors aboard the Dunedin wrote in their diaries of the oppressive silence before departure. "We know the odds," one petty officer scrawled in pencil. "The ice, the Luftwaffe, the submarines. One mistake and we're gone. Still, better to be here than waiting at home." The morale was brittle, held together by routine and duty. The Arctic wind tore at their uniforms as the convoy steamed north, engines thudding beneath frozen decks. The first days passed uneventfully, save for the occasional blip on radar and the constant groaning of ice against hulls. By February 12, the convoy was deep within the Greenland-Iceland gap, where Allied ships relied on intermittent radio contact and coded signal lamps to stay coordinated. The men were exhausted, sleeping in shifts amid the roar of engines and the bitter cold that froze steel solid. Fog rolled in thick as wool, reducing visibility to almost nothing. That night, the signal operators on HMS Dunedin intercepted an uncertain message, a faint SOS from an unknown source. Lights, horizon, unidentified. It was logged and forwarded, then dismissed as atmospheric interference. The next morning, radio silence fell. No word from the Dunedin. No radar echo. Nothing. The formation had been tight, yet within hours, Escort Force H seemed to dissolve into the white void. HMS Keppel, the convoy's lead destroyer, sent a signal to the Admiralty. Force H not in visual range. Request instructions. The reply came hours later, instructing all vessels to maintain course and formation. The convoy pushed onward, unaware that history's curtain had already closed on several hundred men. The struggle for survival in these waters was as much psychological as it was tactical. Sailors learned to read the ice, to gauge the temperature of engines by the way frost formed on bulkheads, and to recognize the subtle tremor of depth charges detonating miles away. Yet no amount of training could prepare them for disappearance. One navigator later recalled, "In those fogs, you could hear the sea breathe, but you couldn't see a thing. You didn't know if you were alone or surrounded." For the Admiralty, the Arctic route was a logistical nightmare but a political necessity. Stalin demanded supplies, and Churchill promised them, no matter the cost. "The passage to Murmansk," Churchill once wrote, "is a battle against both man and nature. But it must be won." Convoy PQ-17 would later become infamous for its tragic fate, but few outside naval circles knew that its precursor, the February mission from Iceland, had already revealed the dangers that lurked unseen in those waters. What happened to the Dunedin and her escorts that week became an enduring question in Allied records. Some believed they had fallen victim to a U-boat wolf pack. Yet no German submarine in the area reported such an engagement, and post-war analyses confirmed no kills matching the ship's tonnage. Others speculated a navigational failure or collision under poor visibility. But the spread of wreckage, when it was eventually sighted, suggested multiple explosions across several miles, not a single impact. By February 15th, with no sign of survivors, the Admiralty declared the ships lost. Only fragments, a lifeboat, a piece of hull plating, a sailor's cap, were later recovered by a Norwegian trawler drifting south of Jan Mayen. In the lifeboat, soaked in salt water, was a torn page from a navigation log. "Turning east, orders unclear, fog thickening. No date, no coordinates. Just a handful of words that would haunt naval historians for decades. For the men who remained with the convoy, the disappearance was a silent warning. In a war where every signal mattered and every command could mean life or death, the Arctic had swallowed its secret without witness. The loss of Escort Force H was quietly buried beneath official reports and classified appendices, dismissed as the chaos of wartime misfortune. Yet those who had heard the final radio bursts, the faint echo of strange lights on the horizon, never forgot. And as Convoy PQ-17 continued north into worsening weather and growing German threat, one truth lingered like frost on the steel decks. In the Arctic, nothing simply vanishes without reason. In the early hours of February 16, 1942, the North Atlantic was a place of whispers and static. Radio operators aboard the surviving ships of the convoy leaned close to their headsets, straining to catch the faintest signal from Escort Force H. All channels were silent. The fog that had rolled in days earlier still clung to the sea, heavy and unbroken. The Dunedin, HMS Volunteer, and USS Elliott were gone, without a distress call, without a trace. At dawn, the convoy's commanding officer, Captain Robert Sherbrooke aboard HMS Keppel, ordered a search grid established. The destroyers Leamington and Ledbury fanned out along the last known bearing of the missing ships. Visibility was less than a mile. The air smelled of oil and cold iron. After 2 hours, the Ledbury reported sighting debris, wood, canvas, and an overturned lifeboat, about 40 miles north of Iceland's Westfords. No bodies, no survivors. Only the fragments of what appeared to be a British signal flag, scorched at the edges. The discovery sent ripples of unease through the convoy. Sailors had seen death before, but this was different. Ships didn't just vanish without a fight. Below deck, speculation ran wild. A U-boat ambush, a minefield, even sabotage. Yet none of those explanations fit the evidence. There had been no torpedo wakes, no explosions reported by sonar. And the Dunedin's last transmission, strange lights on the horizon, had sounded more like confusion than alarm. As Admiralty records later revealed, the missing ship's final radio signals arrived garbled and incomplete. At 22:41 hours on February 14, the Dunedin's wireless log recorded the message: Formation East, unclear signal from command, investigating light sources bearing 08. 20 minutes later, her signal strength weakened and then ceased entirely. No SOS followed. It was as though the ships had steamed into silence itself. Admiral Sir John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, was informed of the loss 2 days later. He noted in his war diary, unexplained disappearance of Dunedin Group. Weather and ice considered moderate. U-boat activity unconfirmed. Cause unknown. For a navy built on procedure and precision, unknown was the most unsettling word of all. Tovey ordered immediate reconnaissance flights from RAF Coastal Command out of Reykjavik. Catalina flying boats scoured the region, their crews enduring sub-zero winds and dwindling daylight. They found nothing, only endless fields of drifting ice and the faint shimmer of auroras above. Among the debris recovered, one item stood out, a half-burned page from a sailor's diary. The handwriting was cramped, the ink faded but legible. It read, "They say we're changing course east, orders from Keppel? But signals don't match. Fog closing in fast. Men uneasy." The entry ended abruptly. No signature. To this day, historians debate whether the diary was authentic, but its tone, the uncertainty, the quiet dread, rang true to those who knew the sea. For the men aboard the remaining convoy ships, the incident deepened a growing sense of isolation. It felt, one petty officer later said, as if we were ghosts ourselves, passing through a graveyard of ice. Routine became a form of survival, checking bearings, scanning radar, maintaining engines that froze solid if idle for too long. Each night, the horizon flickered with northern lights, green, blue, and violet bands that danced eerily above the dark ocean. The sailors began calling them the lights of Dunedin. The Admiralty's Intelligence Division in London worked to reconstruct the convoy's communications log. Operators at the WWII service listening posts in Scotland and Iceland confirmed that no German transmissions mentioned an engagement in the region. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat command, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboot, recorded no victories that week. Even post-war German archives, opened decades later, contained nothing to explain what had happened in those coordinates. If the Dunedin and her escorts had been sunk, it had occurred unseen and unreported. A classified memorandum circulated in March 1942 proposed another possibility: a navigational or identification error. According to the memo, Force H may have received falsified orders or a corrupted signal, perhaps due to atmospheric interference, perhaps due to a fault in the radio frequency. Unverified signals, it warned, are a greater enemy than the enemy himself. The theory was plausible, but it did not explain the physical destruction implied by the wreckage. As months passed, the loss of the Dunedin group was gradually buried in official paperwork. The convoy completed its run to Murmansk, losing several merchant ships to Luftwaffe attacks but delivering enough material to keep the Soviet front supplied. In the official convoy summary, the disappearance was reduced to a single line: Force H, presumed lost at sea, 14 to 15 February 1942, cause unknown. But for the families, silence was unbearable. Letters went unanswered. Telegrams offered only condolences. Missing, presumed lost, a phrase that left room for hope where none remained. One widow from Portsmouth wrote to the Admiralty demanding answers. "My husband's ship cannot simply vanish. If there are no Germans to blame, then what took them?" The reply she received was polite, procedural, and hollow. Decades later, a historian studying declassified documents noticed something odd in the radio logs of February 14th. Several transmissions from the Dunedin were marked Priority Code 6, R&D. That classification typically referred not to routine operations, but to experimental trials. What exactly they were testing was not disclosed. The story of the vanished convoy near Iceland was not just about loss at sea, it was about something deeper: the uncertainty of war, where information could be as treacherous as the ocean itself. And as Allied forces pushed further into the Arctic routes, one question echoed across every bridge and command deck: if it wasn't the enemy that silenced those ships, then what was? Far to the north, under the pale glow of the aurora, the sea kept its secret. The coordinates of the last transmission remained marked on Allied charts for years: an empty patch of ocean, circled in red, labeled with a single word: unresolved. By the spring of 1942, the North Atlantic had become an invisible battlefield, one fought not only with ships and submarines, but with signals, codes, and decisions made in rooms far from the freezing sea. The disappearance of Escort Force H had shaken Allied command, yet the war's tempo allowed no pause for mourning. Another convoy, PQ-17, was being assembled for the perilous run from Iceland to Murmansk. This time, American and British escorts would sail together once more, under orders shaped by the same Admiralty that had quietly buried the Dunedin mystery just weeks before. Convoy PQ-17 departed Valfjord on June 27, 1942. 35 merchant ships carried tanks, aircraft, and ammunition for the Eastern Front. Cargo Stalin demanded, and Churchill had promised to deliver, whatever the cost. The escort included 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, and a covering force of cruisers and battleships further west, led by Admiral Hamilton aboard HMS London. It was a combined show of strength and determination. But beneath the surface of strategy, uncertainty simmered. The loss of Force H had never been explained, and radio operators whispered that the Arctic had a way of swallowing signals whole. 2 days into the voyage, ice and weather forced a slow advance. German reconnaissance planes shadowed from above, reporting positions to the Luftwaffe and U-boat command. "The wolves are gathering," one British captain muttered. By July 2, decrypted Enigma traffic intercepted at Bletchley Park confirmed those fears. Analysts had uncovered references to Rosselsprung, Operation Knight's Move, the code name for a German surface fleet movement involving the battleship Tirpitz. If true, the convoy faced one of the most powerful warships ever built, capable of annihilating the escort screen with a single broadside. The news reached the Admiralty in London through the desk of First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound. Under immense pressure and with intelligence still fragmentary, Pound faced an impossible decision. Should he order the convoy to continue, risking destruction, or scatter the ships in hopes that some might survive? His advisors debated for hours. One recalled later, "We were fighting ghosts, ghosts of messages, ghosts of ships, ghosts of decisions past." The loss of the Dunedin hung over the room like a warning from the sea. On July 4th, at 21:11 hours, the fateful order was sent. "Convoy is to scatter." The command rippled across the Arctic airwaves in Morse code, brief and final. Confusion reigned. Some captains hesitated, believing the signal a mistake. Others obeyed immediately, turning away from the convoy's core and heading independently toward the Russian coast. Within hours, the once cohesive formation dissolved into chaos. German aircraft swooped in, bombing isolated ships. U-boats closed in. Over the next 3 days, 24 of the 35 merchant vessels were sunk. More than 150 men perished in freezing waters that offered no second chances. Later, when questioned by Parliament, Pound defended his order as necessary. He cited Bletchley's decrypts as evidence of an imminent Tirpitz attack, a threat that, in reality, never came. The Tirpitz had left port, yes, but turned back before engaging. The convoy had been scattered by fear itself. A Royal Navy officer at Scapa Flow summed it up bitterly. "We ran from a shadow, and the shadow devoured us." For the intelligence officers at Bletchley Park, the disaster was a grim lesson in the perils of half-truths. One analyst wrote in his report, "Information without context is worse than ignorance." Yet, amid the wreckage and loss, another puzzle emerged. Logs from PQ-17 surviving ships showed inexplicable bursts of static and interference during the hours before the scatter order. Wireless officers noted unusual cross signals, almost as if multiple commands had been transmitted on the same frequency. Some speculated that German jamming had played a role. Others, remembering the Dunedin, suspected something else, perhaps an Allied experiment gone awry. Admiral Hamilton, who had commanded the escort force, later confided to his aide that he believed the real enemy that night was confusion. His private notes, declassified decades later, referenced the Iceland incident as a precursor, an unspoken link between vanished ships and misdirected orders. Whether deliberate or coincidental, the parallels were chilling. Fog, interference, sudden course changes, and loss without direct enemy engagement. In the war's aftermath, the disaster of PQ-17 became one of the most studied naval operations in history. Historians debated whether the decision to scatter had been a strategic miscalculation or a tragic necessity. But in the margins of those discussions, the mystery of Escort Force H remained, a smaller story, overshadowed yet curiously similar. One convoy lost to silence, another undone by its echo. In his memoir Naval Decisions 1939 to 1945, Vice Admiral Philip Vian reflected, "The Arctic did not forgive error. It magnified it." He might have added, "It also concealed it." For beneath the ice and secrecy of wartime communications, the line between signal and deception had blurred beyond recognition. As the surviving ships limped into Murmansk, battered and half-empty, few spoke of the earlier disappearance near Iceland. Yet, in the corridors of the Admiralty, whispers persisted that the same frequency, coded for experimental use, had been active during both events. If true, it suggested not coincidence, but continuity. And so the question deepened: what exactly had the Dunedin been testing on that cold February night, and had its ghost returned to haunt the Arctic once more? By autumn of 1942, the Arctic convoys had become a symbol of endurance. Each voyage through the frigid seas north of Iceland was a wager against fate, one made not only with ships and steel, but with trust in orders that might, at any moment, lead to death. The loss of PQ-17 had shaken Allied morale to its core, yet another convoy, PQ-18, was already being assembled. This time, the Admiralty promised, things would be different. Every transmission would be verified. Every escort accounted for. But the shadows of the vanished Dunedin and the scattered convoy still haunted every bridge and operations room. In London, Admiralty intelligence worked day and night to review signals history. Files labeled Confidential North Atlantic Operations contained a string of unexplained entries. Transmissions received but never verified, bursts of Morse with no origin, and curiously, several signals believed to have come from call signs associated with Force H. It was impossible. Those ships were gone. Yet in mid-July, several convoy escorts reported hearing faint transmissions signed DNDN, the Dunedin's identification code. The signals were short, indistinct, and always ended abruptly. Could be atmospheric echo, one operator suggested, or a rebroadcast off the ionosphere. Others were less certain. The frequencies matched the range known to be used by experimental communications units working out of Scopper Flow. That summer, a quiet investigation began under the direction of Captain Edward Parry of the Admiralty's Signals Branch. His team, drawn from Royal Navy Intelligence and the Post Office Research Department, combed through thousands of pages of radio logs. They discovered a disturbing pattern. On at least 3 separate occasions between February and July 1942, convoy escorts had reported orders that were never officially sent. Orders instructing course changes, scatter maneuvers, or radar silence. Each time, chaos followed. If interference, Parry wrote in his notes, it is too consistent to be random. Meanwhile, at Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts poring over Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine traffic noticed something equally odd. German Enigma decrypts made no mention of attacks on those convoys prior to Allied losses. One decrypted Luftwaffe signal even complained of missed opportunities. German aircraft had spotted merchant vessels already damaged or burning, yet no attack orders had been given. In short, the Germans were just as puzzled as the Allies. It appeared that the Arctic was staging its own war, a silent conflict fought through radio waves and fog. Among the few surviving logs from that period was one from the USS Wasp, which operated as an escort carrier on Arctic patrol in late 1942. A line from her communications diary reads, "Night of September 11th, received 2 conflicting signals on frequency 10.3 MHz. One instructs, course 070 east. Another, maintain present. Both carry Admiralty verification. Decided to hold. Investigation requested." The signalmen aboard the Wasp would later recall the eerie clarity of those messages. Crisp, authoritative, and undeniably official. Yet London insisted only one had been transmitted. The rest, they said, must have been interference. When interviewed years later, one of Parry's assistants described how those anomalies led to an unsettling theory, that the phantom signals were the byproduct of Allied electronic warfare experiments. In early 1942, both the British Telecommunications Research Establishment and the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory were testing radar countermeasures. Primitive jamming and deception systems meant to confuse German U-boats. The Dunedin had reportedly been equipped with an early prototype. Its logs before departure from Iceland mention classified radio apparatus, Directive number 42/9. If that equipment malfunctioned, it might have flooded nearby frequencies with ghost signals, including falsified commands. But there was another, darker possibility. Some suspected deliberate interference. In 1946, declassified memos hinted that German intelligence had been experimenting with signal simulation, impersonating Allied call signs to sow confusion. If the Kriegsmarine had discovered how to mimic British frequency bands, the disappearance of Force H could have been an early success. No one could prove it, and by then, the truth was buried under a mountain of post-war secrecy. Captain Parry's final report concluded with an ambiguous statement. The loss of Dunedin and related convoy miscommunications cannot be dismissed as mere error. The circumstances suggest an overlap of human misjudgment and experimental signal activity. Cause: unknown. Probability of repetition: high. It was filed under restricted circulation, accessible only to senior command. For the sailors who continued to brave the Arctic routes, none of this mattered. They followed orders, trusted their instruments, and prayed the voice on the radio truly belonged to their own command. "The sea teaches humility," one officer later said. "It does not explain itself." By late 1942, the convoys were better defended, and radar technology had improved. Yet every time static filled the radio room, men still looked to one another in silence. Somewhere in the back of their minds lingered the question Admiral Tovey himself once wrote in a private note: "What if the fog of war is not only in men's minds, but in their machines?" The investigation into the Dunedin was closed before Christmas 1942. Its files were sealed for decades. Officially, the Admiralty concluded that Force H had likely struck drifting ice or an uncharted minefield. But those who had seen the full report knew better. There was no mention of ice, no evidence of mines, only scattered transmissions and an absence of facts. And so, while convoys continued north into the Arctic night, a quiet understanding settled over the Admiralty's war rooms. Something had happened out there that no one could fully explain. Something between signal and silence. Between command and chaos. And though the files were stamped closed, the sea, as always, refused to forget. For nearly 3 decades after the war, the disappearance of HMS Dunedin and her escorting destroyers remained a classified footnote in naval history. In official convoy summaries, their loss was attributed to enemy action or severe weather conditions. Phrases that satisfied bureaucracy but silenced curiosity. It wasn't until the 1970s, amid the wave of declassification that followed the Cold War détente, that the truth began to surface, one torn file at a time. The first clue came not from the Admiralty, but from a private researcher named Peter Ashcroft, a retired Royal Navy wireless officer who had served in Arctic convoys during 1943. While reviewing signal logs at the Public Record Office in Kew, Ashcroft discovered a file labeled Experimental Naval Communications, 1942, Confidential. Inside were fragments of correspondence between the Admiralty's Research and Development Division and the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. The subject line read, Project Refraction, Radar Signal Nullification Tests, Atlantic Trials. The date, February 10, 1942, just 3 days before the Dunedin vanished. The document suggested that the Dunedin had been fitted with experimental radio and radar equipment designed to jam enemy detection systems by reflecting false signals. Early electronic countermeasures, the ancestors of what would later become chaff and active jamming technology. The ship had been under orders to conduct limited field trials in coordination with a classified listening post on Jan Mayen Island. However, nowhere in the surviving documents was there a record of test results, signal logs, or post-trial reports. It was as if the operation had been erased. Ashcroft published his findings in a small naval history journal, proposing that the radar interference experiment may have triggered catastrophic equipment failure. According to his theory, the Dunedin's new jamming transmitters could have overloaded the ship's communication arrays, cutting contact with the convoy and possibly disabling key navigation systems. The ships might have turned east under faulty orders, steamed blindly into the pack ice, and been crushed or sunk by collision. Technology, Ashcroft wrote, may have destroyed the very vessels it was meant to protect. When his article appeared in 1974, it caused a minor storm in naval circles. Surviving veterans of the convoys wrote letters of support and protest alike. One former signalman, aged 82, sent Ashcroft a chilling note. "We were told it was routine. But nothing about that voyage felt routine. They made us seal compartments around some new radio gear. No explanation. Just orders." He signed only with his initials, TB, and never wrote again. Further confirmation came from declassified American records. A U.S. Navy memo dated March 3, 1942, referenced lost contact with British radar trial group operating under North Atlantic conditions. The file was marked, Eyes Only, for Admiral Ernest King. In the margin, someone had written in pencil, Possible equipment malfunction, advise discontinue further field trials. The memo's timing aligned precisely with the disappearance of Escort Force H. Yet even within that file, the ship's name was redacted. By the late 1970s, The story gained traction among historians who saw it as emblematic of wartime innovation's hidden costs. The rush to outpace German radar had led to reckless experimentation at sea, where conditions made testing unpredictable and dangerous. Electronic countermeasures, once a scientific curiosity, had been pushed into combat without the safety protocols later standard in peacetime. A confidential Admiralty review from 1946, later unearthed by a BBC journalist, acknowledged losses possibly attributable to field trials exceeding operational parameters. Still, mystery clung to the Dunedin like frost. Why had her crew not been warned of the risks? Why was her last logbook missing? And why had survivors' families been told nothing of the radar equipment on board? The Ministry of Defense, pressed for answers, issued a careful statement in 1977. No conclusive evidence exists regarding the loss of HMS Dunedin in 1942. While the vessel was engaged in experimental operations, her disappearance remains under review. It was the first official admission that something secret had indeed been underway. Ashcroft continued his research until his death in 1981, leaving behind a single handwritten note in his archive. They didn't vanish, they were silenced. The fog wasn't natural. Though likely metaphorical, his phrasing captured the emotional truth felt by many veterans. That wartime secrecy, though necessary, often erased more than it preserved. In the decades that followed, the Dunedin mystery faded once again from public view, overshadowed by larger narratives of victory and loss. Yet among naval historians and signal intelligence scholars, it endured as a quiet cautionary tale, a reminder that the front lines of war often extended far beyond the reach of guns or torpedoes. As one declassified training manual from 1945 later observed, in warfare, knowledge itself is a weapon, but a weapon mishandled can wound its wielder first. The fate of HMS Dunedin was perhaps one such wound, a self-inflicted scar hidden beneath layers of ice and silence. And though the official files remained incomplete, whispers persisted of a final chapter. One last clue beneath the Arctic ice that might reveal, at last, what truly happened on that frozen night in 1942. In 1998, 56 years after the disappearance of HMS Dunedin and her escorts, the Arctic finally began to give up a few of its secrets. A Norwegian survey team from the University of Tromsø, led by marine archaeologist Dr. Ingrid Lugge, was mapping seabed anomalies near Jan Mayen Island when sonar detected a large metallic structure lying in two sections, partially buried beneath silt and ice. Its shape, narrow, with a distinct cruiser's bow, immediately caught attention. At first, it was thought to be a German wreck, perhaps a U-boat lost on patrol. But as diverse and remote cameras descended through the black water, the truth emerged. A heavily corroded Royal Navy warship bearing faint traces of a hull number beginning with H, consistent with the Dunedin's escort flotilla. Word spread quietly through naval history circles before reaching the British Ministry of Defence. Within months, a joint Anglo-Norwegian expedition was assembled to verify the find. What they uncovered deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The wreck showed signs of multiple internal explosions, not from torpedoes or mines, but from within, bulkheads blown outward, compartments twisted by pressure differentials. The bridge and radio room were completely destroyed, as if by an intense electrical discharge or internal blast. No torpedo holes, no shell impacts, no evidence of external attack. The sea had preserved the wreck as a riddle in steel. Among the items recovered by remotely operated vehicle was a small brass plate inscribed, Directive 42/9, do not remove. It matched the codename found in the 1970s research, Project Refraction. There was also a warped metal frame believed to be part of a high-frequency transmitter array, far ahead of standard 1942 naval technology. The discovery reignited debate within the naval community. Had the Dunedin fallen victim to her own experimental device? Dr. Lugge presented her findings at a conference in Oslo the following year. Her conclusion was careful but provocative. The evidence suggests catastrophic failure of an internal power or transmission system, perhaps a prototype of electronic countermeasure equipment. Given the absence of external damage, the most plausible cause is self-induced destruction during signal testing. Yet even as she spoke, representatives from the British delegation declined to comment. Officially, the wreck was identified only as a British naval vessel lost in Arctic operations, 1942. For the families of the lost sailors, the discovery brought both closure and renewed grief. Memorials were updated. In Portsmouth Cathedral, the name HMS Dunedin was re-engraved under the inscription, "Their watch ended in silence." Veterans who had served on later convoys visited the Arctic site, leaving wreaths that drifted away on the grey water, vanishing into the mist much as the ship once had. In 2003, a BBC documentary revisited the case, combining Ashcroft's research, Dr. Luga's findings, and newly released archival material. It revealed that Project Refraction had indeed been a top-secret joint effort to develop radar jamming systems using ultra-high frequency transmission. The Dunedin's mission was to test whether such signals could cloak a convoy from German reconnaissance. The equipment, however, lacked proper shielding. The report concluded that an electrical overload or feedback surge might have ignited munitions near the communication deck, triggering a chain reaction that destroyed the ship and her escorts almost instantaneously. No official apology was ever issued. The Admiralty quietly updated its historical record in 2004, acknowledging experimental operations, but maintaining that the precise cause remains undetermined. For historians, that phrasing said everything. The line between truth and secrecy was still guarded, even half a century later. Yet one final piece of evidence surfaced in 2005. A Norwegian fisherman operating near the wreck site recovered a small, sealed metal cylinder, likely from a signal buoy. Inside was a water-damaged but legible note, bearing the Dunedin's radio header. It read simply, "Equipment unstable. Transmission looped. Signal repeating. Request immediate guidance." The timestamp, 2245, February 14, 1942. The very minute the Dunedin vanished from Allied radar. For some, that note was the final answer. For others, it only deepened the enigma. Had the ship's own transmission echoed endlessly through the Arctic sky, masking itself until the system tore the vessel apart? Or was it a tragic coincidence, a last desperate message lost in the storm? Today, when naval officers study the Arctic convoys at the Royal Navy College in Dartmouth, the Dunedin case is still mentioned, not as a failure, but as a lesson. A lesson about innovation, communication, and the thin boundary between courage and catastrophe. As one lecturer tells his cadets, the men of the Dunedin faced an enemy they never saw, and perhaps one of their own making. They sailed into silence to give us the means to see through it. And so, the Arctic keeps its vigil. Beneath the ice near Jan Mayen, the remains of a lost experiment rest quietly in the deep, an enduring reminder that in war, not all secrets are buried by the enemy. Some are carried down by those who were told only one thing: trust the signal.